Welcome back to our live coverage of the RNC. I'm Robbie Suave, and I'm joined by Jessica Burbank, who co-hosts Rising with me. We obviously just watched that speech, very long speech by former President Donald Trump as he accepts formally the nomination to be the 2024 Republican candidate. My take was that it was a very effective speech early on, as he detailed what it was like to go through that assassination attempt, the bullet going right past his head. I'm nicking his ear and feeling the blood and that moment of concern. And he had a lot of very kind words about the crowd and about the victims. And this was the first time we got to hear from him on this front. And I think everyone was glued to their TV screens, or if you were down there at the convention, everyone was paying attention to what he had to say. He said that this was the only time he's ever going to talk about it because it was actually very horrifying and very painful. And it seemed it was an unusually, certainly somber and restrained moment from Donald Trump. And then he got into kind of his usual rally shtick. What did you think, Jessica?
Well, we've never seen anything like it. Many people are saying no one's ever seen anything like it. Nothing's ever been this special, Robbie. We had the usual Trumpisms all the way throughout. I think a lot of people wondered if, the assassination attempt would be a spiritual moment and he would be some kind of changed man. This speech confirmed that he is not. He did not find God. After all of the calls for unity, Robbie, I'm surprised that what we're getting from Trump are statements like, we've seen the murder rate drop in Caracas, Venezuela. Used to be a very dangerous place. We've seen it drop 70%. The figure changed a few times. I'm not sure what it really is. But he said that if the other guy wins, that the RNC is going to have to be in Caracas the next time. That's not exactly a unity type statement. That doesn't make me feel like we're all on the same team here. He spoke about people leaving Wisconsin to go to the nation's capital, which he called a killing field. And he said that you can come from Wisconsin, visit the National Monument, and people are getting shot and stabbed. That's also not exactly a message of unity and to quell violence. He's saying he's the only guy that can fix that. He's also talking about migrants taking Hispanic jobs and black jobs. It's just not giving the unity vibe that saying the word unity seems to provide in his mind. He thinks that just speaking the words into existence, it's happening. But the rest of his speech negated the first portion.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, you're right that that's certainly been the reaction from, a lot of people I follow in media who, hate Trump anyway. So it's right that he did not refrain from saying anything about the state of the country or complaining about how Joe Biden has run it or, going to any of his previous kind of lines. No, you're right. He did that. He talked about illegal immigration. He talked about crime, including in the nation's capital, where crime has been, it's not as bad this year as it was last year, but there was a major wave of crime that's receded partly, but not entirely. And there are a lot of myself living here. There's a lot of concerns about, people are not getting shot and stabbed constantly, but there is a sense that the Democratic leadership of the city, there's just one city in America, has lost control of how to deal with crime here. So maybe it's not a unifying message, but ultimately it can't be all that unified. He's running against Joe Biden. He thinks Joe Biden has a failed record. He thinks the policies were very bad, and he set out to correct them. I think it was restrained in terms of its tone because it was just 4 or 5 days ago that he was almost assassinated, that he was injured, and it's not a serious injury, thank goodness, but he might, for all we know, he could be in a lot of pain. He could be taking painkillers. He seemed more sedated than he usually does, reflecting, I think, the somber thing he went through. So yes, I saw a lot of criticism from the media that he did get political as expected for the second part of the speech. I don't know that really loses him anything or gains him anything. I don't ultimately think it's going to matter all that much. He could have kept the speech shorter, certainly, so that you and I could have gone to bed a little bit earlier. But other than that, I think it's still and the whole convention, frankly, a pretty big win for Republicans in terms of turning up their energy in anticipation of the weeks to come in the election.
Well, everybody loses when there's violence in America, right, Robbie? I think when the murder rate has been down, according to the statistics at a national level, including in America's biggest cities, at a time when you're calling for unity and saying that existential threats, saying that the election is a choice that does threaten your life, that there are existential threats of either side, that rhetoric is what causes people to do things like the shooter did on Saturday. And so when I think about him making the threats of crime on the rise in Washington somehow affecting people there in Wisconsin because they're there visiting as tourists to Washington, D.C., and that they'll be killed there, and he's the only guy who can fix that, and violence will get so bad you'll have to go to Crocus. He's telling people there's an existential threat that the election depends on. That is exactly the type of rhetoric that they're saying caused the violence that we observed on Saturday. So it just didn't feel like a speech with unity in it at all for me.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the people saying that about how Democratic or media rhetoric. What's that?
I'm the people saying it. You could just talk to me.
You're the people. No. I was not talking about those people. I was saying those on the right who have blamed anti-Trump rhetoric for causing the violence. I've called that out repeatedly on our show because I don't think that's fair. I don't really think this. I think there's a very much more tenuous than the media likes to pretend connection between political rhetoric and political violence in this country, or violence aimed at political figures. We still don't know very much about the shooter from over the weekend. Although what we are learning is that he Googled Biden and I'm having a mental health crisis, and it so happened that the Trump was speaking in a location that was closer to him than wherever Joe Biden was going to be speaking. Joe Biden's not doing as many speaking appearances, and as far as we know now, this could be just a deranged person without any sort of political agenda, especially one that's attached to violent rhetoric. So I'm shaming the violent rhetoric shamers right now, but that's
and it's kind of rich that two of those guys are J.D. Vance and Don Jr., who are in the Trump camp, saying that the violent rhetoric of the Democrats is what caused this by them saying democracy is in peril. I'd say it's worse to say your lives are at stake. That seems more extreme. Whoa. But everyone seemingly at the convention, even just before Trump went out and spoke, was in lockstep with messaging around why he's running as well. That he doesn't need this, that he has enough money, that he's just doing this out of the goodness of his heart because he wants to serve the American people that have been left behind, kind of on the same beat as J.D. Vance. I think that's very interesting that we heard that same message no matter who was up at the microphone today. But let's not forget that Trump potentially faces prison time, and you can't arrest a sitting president. So he could be skirting going to prison by being in office. Robbie, did you notice everyone saying that exact same thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense that he has risked a whole lot to pursue the presidency again. I think that's certainly true. I think the arguments that they would not, obviously, if he had not tried to remain in office after losing the 2020 election, he would not be in all the criminal legal liability he suffered because of that. His pursuit of the presidency, at all costs, has put himself in a perilous position that many of his supporters find admirable, that he's willing to, in their view, risk it all in order to return to the presidency and deliver them the policies that he has promised and the things that he's run on. Again, I have to point out, and I've pointed this out before, but the RNC this year is a major testament. And we didn't really have an RNC 4 years ago because it was COVID times. 8 years before that, going back to Trump's first election, he was not. He was opposed still. Nominally, he'd won the nomination, but not everyone had fallen in line. Ted Cruz gave a speech at the convention where he did not endorse Donald Trump, where he told people to vote their conscience, and it was chaotic, and there was a sense that it was hopeless. That they were feeling the way Democrats are feeling this year. They were feeling like Donald Trump was certainly going to lose. They were going to lose the presidency, and they were going to refigure things out for how once Trump had lost, it was over, and they were planned for four years ahead. Today, Trump is in total control of the party. He is beloved by the party. All of the elites have fallen behind him. His own daughter-in-law was in charge of planning the convention. His whole family is there and is supporting him. There is no one that in good standing on the right who is against him. His vanquished rivals for the nomination this time, and some of them from last time, are all there endorsing him. that is a tremendous advantage that he has going to the election this time, that everyone on the right is on his side. So then it falls to the undecided voters, the swing voters. Did they tune into some of this coverage? Did they hear something they like? I don't know. I think he's still going to be making a case to them in the coming weeks, but also they're clearly going to be hearing maybe from Joe Biden. I mean, we're getting all these reports that he could be dropping out as soon as this weekend. I'm still a little skeptical of that, but I'm sounding increasingly Pollyannish because everyone else thinks he's a goner. Although I saw some of that reporting walk back as the closest people to Biden still said, "What are you talking about? No one's writing a dropping out speech for him. He's staying." So we'll have to see. Now that does conclude our post-RNC coverage. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate it. Welcome back to Rising. We are continuing with our post-RNC Night 4 coverage, and we are continuing to discuss the Trump speech that just took place here with Jessica Burbank, and we're joined by Amber Duke, who is actually there at the convention in Milwaukee. Thanks for waiting up for us, Amber. We appreciate it.
Of course. Well, y'all are actually an hour ahead of me, so really I should be thanking you.
I guess so. Well, we are tired. Tell us, the mood, I'm sure, was I could tell it was very quiet while Trump was describing for the first time, breaking his silence on the details of the shooting. And I was glued to my screen. I'm sure everyone watching was. And then it kind of got into more of his usual thing. And I saw some people start to check their phones and go, how much, this is the longest speech I've ever heard in my life. But give us your reaction.
Yeah, it was really interesting because most of the convention today was really rowdy. We had Tucker Carlson, who received, I think, arguably the biggest applause after Trump of the entire convention. Hulk Hogan ripping his shirt off. We had Dana White from UFC introducing Trump. Kid Rock, changing some of the lyrics to one of his songs to support Trump. I mean, people were basically partying in the convention center, and then Trump comes out and he promises to retell the story of the assassination attempt, although he said it was the only time that we would ever hear him do it because it was too painful for him to tell. And it was gripping, it was moving. I saw people crying, but there was also laughter. He was cracking jokes a little bit throughout his retelling of what happened. But I thought, it was politically obviously brilliant, but even just from a human perspective, I think it was important for the country to hear from him and what exactly happened and just feel a little bit inspired, I think, by what he went through. But he didn't even talk so much about himself. He talked actually more about the Secret Service response, which has been criticized by some conservatives, but he praised the people who jumped on him as he was in the line of fire. He talked about the individual who lost his life and then the other supporters who were injured from the would-be assassins' bullets. And he talked about the crowd response and how he was really proud of them because they stayed so calm throughout what was happening and didn't stampede, which he said saved a lot of lives. So I think it was really pitch perfect, that first 20 minutes.
I found it very interesting. We got some insight into what Trump's policymaking looks like. He spoke about his plan to take away taxes on tips for service workers like bartenders and waitresses. And he was speaking with a waitress who complained about taxes being taken out of her paycheck. And that's where he came up with the policy, and that he saved a lot of money. A lot of D.C. politicians pay consultants to do all of this means testing research and come up with their policies. I think it's good to talk to working class people. But I think we also watched a new policy get made on the fly. And I have ADHD. I might say Trump is potentially our first ADHD president, because this is how it went. He said that if he were in office, Hamas would have never invaded Israel, would have never started a war in the Middle East, is how he put it. He talked about how we need to bring our hostages back. And then he went on to say we need an Iron Dome here in the United States, which is interesting because I do believe our borders and skies are surveilled quite heavily. I think we have the equivalent of an Iron Dome, or maybe even a more sophisticated version. But he brought it up time and again throughout the more rambling portion towards the end of his speech. I thought it was fascinating to hear him say that over and over. I guess we're getting an Iron Dome if he becomes president.
Yeah, it was the policy part, I mean, the policy part was, a lot of it was textbook Trump. Some of it was, I think, come up with on the fly. It seemed to me he was going off the prompter a lot, maybe, displaying his ability to do that much better than his rival, Joe Biden, who we don't even know for sure is still going to be in the race come Monday. From all the reporting we're seeing, it's looking maybe increasingly like not, although I'm still a little bit skeptical. And, these kind of media people that say Biden is going to be out any minute have been wrong so many times in the past. I think we have to take that with a grain of salt. I, too, thought the Tucker Carlson speech was probably the best delivered, actually, probably overall speech of the entire convention. And then I did find it interesting, Kid Rock, Hulk Hogan, Dana White getting the penultimate speaking slot, sort of, or maybe or one of third to last, something like that. It speaks to a kind of what has been described as like barstool conservatives, or an archetype of now younger, more dude-leading people who had voted Democrat before and are not necessarily socially conservative, but like are against cancel culture and what now counts as like social or like culturally conservative values. It seemed like a lot of this was geared toward them. Maybe that's been identified as a kind of voter the Trump campaign really wants to pick up in Rust Belt states in the Midwest. What did could you get any insight into that from who you were talking to at the convention, Amber?
Yeah, and first I just want to mention that the Tucker speech, I agree, it was really well done. He was actually the only speaker, I believe, that did not use a teleprompter. He just had a timer up on the screen, and he just did all of that from, I don't know, from memory or just off the cuff. But yeah, it was pretty incredible.
That's amazing.
So I know he's a very gifted orator, obviously. But on this point about the barstool conservatism and sort of the energy, I mean, you hear from people in here, it's like a vibe shift. The vibes are high. There's a different kind of energy with the Republican Party. And I definitely think that's intentional. I mean, just going back to 2016, when Trump first announced he was bringing in all of these new voters who had previously voted Democrat and were part of the blue wall, who then came over to him because they felt like he was speaking for working class Americans in a way that they had never really heard before from a politician. And what we saw tonight was described by Chris Wallace on CNN as testosterone. He was asked to describe it in one word, and that was what he said. But I do think it's keeping in line with that idea of the party shifting towards a more populist message. A lot of it is about just trying to energize and motivate people and listen to people and what they want to see. And people are sick of the stuffy, like, consultant class, donor class, like BS that has ruled the two-party system for so long. They just want to feel something a little bit more authentic.
There were a couple points I want to ask you about what the response was like from the audience. We couldn't get the full picture unless they were pretty loud there in the audience. We could mostly hear Trump's voice. One was when he said, it's nice to have friends, in reference to Kim Jong-un, who have a lot of nuclear weapons. I want to know what the room's reaction to that was. And then also when he said, I want to buy your vote, or rather, I'm trying to buy your vote, is the direct quote from him. I will be honest about that, and I promise to make Wisconsin great again. That's illegal to buy votes. Of course, he was probably joking, classic Trump, but how did people react?
Yeah, he was definitely joking. Everyone in the audience laughed when he said both of those lines. There was a lot of laugh lines throughout the speech. We talked a little bit earlier about the length of it, and I agree that it was probably about 30 to 45 minutes too long. But I noticed something. I watched a lot of Trump speeches in my life, and one thing that I noticed is he was getting close to the end of the speech that was on the teleprompter that was prepared for him. He actually almost intentionally stopped himself and started telling stories. Telling the story about going to rallies with his dad to see Billy Graham at Yankee Stadium, and then went back to the teleprompter. It wasn't a normal sort of can't help myself kind of riffing that we would see from Trump. And I genuinely got the sense that he was really grateful to be there and just sort of soaking up the moment and really enjoying it. And I think that's understandable given obviously what happened on Saturday.
Well, we are grateful that you were there, Amber, and we will leave it there. Everybody can go to sleep or maybe get a drink. That's and Rising will be back tomorrow morning. Make sure you tune in. Thanks for watching.
Good morning and happy Friday. We have more news than we know what to do with today, so let's get right into it. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was sentenced to 16 years in prison by a Russian court. He was convicted of espionage charges that the US government says are wholly fabricated. Reports say that the trial moved unusually fast, which could mean developments are underway for a prisoner swap. There's also a worldwide tech outage, so hopefully you can see us. We will also get to that. And of course, President Biden, former President Trump, so much more, the RNC, blah, 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 all that and more to get to.
It's good to be back with you, Niall.
It's good to be back with you too, Nayyera.
Donald Trump, of course, delivered his long-awaited speech last night, and many eyes were on the former president. Others couldn't help but direct their focus to the current president, Joe Biden. Ahead of Trump's speech, journalists, news outlets, and pretty much everyone on social media seemed to be covering totally different worlds. There was the Trump and what he was saying and what's going to happen, and then there was the Biden Democratic presidential ticket challenges. Here is what CBS News was saying as Donald Trump entered the venue last night, his big moment.
Some more breaking news.
All right, Robert.
One of President Biden's confidants, historian John Meacham, who has written many speeches for President Biden, just said on the record to CBS News, any report about my doing anything with the speech is totally false. There had been reports out that John Meacham, so close to President Biden, was working up potentially on an exit the race speech. John Meacham just went on the record with CBS News, said the report about my doing anything with the speech is totally false.
And the White House also coming out with a statement saying it's completely false that the president would make a major announcement in the coming days. They're coming out and pushing back pretty hard.
Democratic Congressman Jim Costa then phoned into CBS News last night during live RNC coverage. This is Trump's moment. And he said Biden can no longer be president.
There's a congressman from California, Democrat, named Jim Costa, no relation. He just called CBS News watching our coverage and said he has decided just now to announce that he can no longer support President Biden remaining in the race. He said it's time for President Biden, his friend. He's a moderate Democrat, one of those blue dogs in the House. He said it's time for President Biden to leave the race. He made the decision in the last hour, and he said other Democrats are moving in that direction. So this is such a fluid moment. Yep. You have the Republican National Convention unfolding, and Democratic House members are watching CBS and saying, enough's enough.
And doing this on the night that Donald Trump accepts his party's nomination for the third time.
Now, if you tuned into MSNBC last night, you might have thought Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid and Jen Psaki were in Milwaukee. But it turns out that actually they were in front of a green screen. That's a move some news outlets, like the New York Post, are claiming was MSNBC's attempt to pull the wool over America's eyes, and others would think it's the New York Post finding something to be outraged about every day, as they tend to do. So anyway, disgraced political journalist Mark Halperin was also reporting on the two worlds.
I'm here in Milwaukee, but our main topic will be Joe Biden. I've talked to multiple Democratic sources familiar with his thinking on what is going on. Everyone told me in Biden world that this would happen gradually and then all of a sudden, and it has happened all of a sudden. The expectation, Joe Biden now has agreed to withdraw from the presidential race this weekend, as early as Saturday. Most of my sources believe Sunday's more likely.
That is the whole media coverage vibe of the RNC. What do you think, Nayyera?
It's so much about vibes, right? There was a moment where Trump came out actually onto the stage and big flashing lights saying the word Trump. And it reminded me of kind of actually like what a drag show looks like. And it's like I sense this very weird vibe of the showmanship versus wanting to have the conservatism and bring some of that in. So this idea of RNC unity, I thought was fascinating, but people just can't seem to focus on Trump, even in Trump's biggest moment of coming in front of this crowd and his acolytes cheering him on. It's still about and I guess that's how it should be, is the guy in the White House
right.
and what he's going to do.
Well, it is. I mean, it's yet again one of the, I mean, we seem to be in unprecedented scenarios every week or every day these days, right? But
it's like the gods said that this election is too boring, way too predictable, and we just need to throw a wrench in it.
Well, I mean, we were all thinking about, what, a month or so ago? It's like, oh, this is going to be a kind of dreary campaign, and then the world exploded. But, I mean, it was, I suppose, a challenge for everybody in the media to have that split screen, have the two things going on in unison. The thing about it from a Trumpian or Republican perspective is I think they're probably fine with that, right? I mean, it's not a downside for them to watch Democrats fighting with each other or to suggest that the president has a fragile grasp on the Democratic nomination. It's all quite beneficial to Republicans, I thought.
And this is part of I think the Trump calculus, is they have said behind closed doors and even in the background whispers that appear in newspaper articles that they want Biden on the ticket because that idea of the implosion of Biden, the implosion of the Democratic Party that comes through that way is much easier. And plus, they've been planning for that for quite some time. The sleepy Joe Biden was a message that they hammered over and over again until, like, my mom can recite that. And that's her perspective now. So they were very, very effective, and they want to reap the benefits of that. I also can't imagine, though, that someone like Trump, we know the ego, we know the showmanship, if they had cut in with saying, oh, Kamala Harris did this, or some other Republican did this, like that would have absolutely driven him nuts. And he did try to, I guess, have some kind of unity message, but that the unity that we're seeing still seems to be about anti-Biden and not everybody in the Republican Party on the same page. Were you getting that sense from watching it?
I mean, I'm just very skeptical of the Trump unity thing or the new Trump thing. Seems to me that for the best part of a decade, various reporters have honestly made fools of themselves by suggesting that there's a new Trump at hand.
This is the moment Trump became president.
There's going to be a pivot now. He's going to pivot to the center. Like, he's not. He's not. I mean, that's not who he is. I don't even mean that in any particularly denigratory way about him. It's just like Donald Trump is Donald Trump. He's, whatever, 78 he just turned. He's not going to change now, even in light of the dramatic events of Saturday. So there was this sort of attempt at the start of the speech to be to adopt a less belligerent tone than usual. And then it was like at a certain point, the edit dropped in, and then it was just like back to the normal stuff of crazy Nancy Pelosi and Democrats are all trying to penalise me by mounting these criminal cases against me, and just typical standard Trump fare.
Yeah, and that's part of the appeal. Like that's what he has played on, and that's the authenticity there. And that's, I think, the challenge that people feel lied to about Biden, right? That there was an authenticity that we were being told and given that is not. It's genuinely not the case anymore. He was, Biden was supposed to be a transitional president.
Sure.
And that's not part of something that he campaigned on. I think many people voted for him for that idea of post-COVID stability, post-economic collapse stability, with that hope that there would be a transition, and the DNC just didn't start that transition, and Biden didn't start that transition early enough. So now we have folks just watching the RNC and talking about what's going on with the Democratic Party.
I'm not feeling either of us in a sense of hyper outrage with this dumbass New York Post story about whether MSNBC hosts were in front of a green screen or not.
I mean, half of the movies that we go to watch right now are green screen. I mean, it's just the reality of television and movie making and technology. So I don't get that. And I think it's another effort to paint this idea of the media against Trump. And I'm like, guys, also it's MSNBC. Do you think that RNC actually wants MSNBC set up there?
Well,
like, what?
There's also just the media tendency, I think, that there are various people who you can name, whatever side you're on, you can throw out these names. So if you're on MSNBC, you go Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, Project 2025, Laura Ingraham. And if you're on the other side, you go Joy Reid, Rachel Maddow. And it's just, it's such a game. And I think people are being taken as marks on it, honestly.
Well, and I think those, that might be immediate clickbait, but that's clearly not the tone of the country right now, where that's part of that polarization and why 60%, if not more, of Americans at this moment just a couple of weeks before the election, are still unaffiliated with a political party. The party politics and that partisanship isn't working for people.
Sure, absolutely. Well, plenty more to discuss, as I mentioned in the introduction. Please join us. We're coming right back. This next story might make you feel like we're living in the Twilight Zone. Microsoft reported a worldwide tech outage overnight that led to massive disruptions in airlines around the globe, banks, hospitals, and various other businesses. Delta Airlines announced just this morning that it is grounding its planes, keeping its global flight schedule paused.
Well, we now know that the global glitch was brought on by cybersecurity company CrowdStrike. Just watch that stock plummet, which says a software update caused the malfunctions. CrowdStrike CEO George Kurtz said the problem has been isolated and fixed. Here is how it came out across on the Today Show.
We know what the issue is. We're resolving and have resolved the issue now. It's recovering systems that are out there. And essentially, as you've talked about in the statement I put out, is the system was sent an update, and that update had a software bug in it and caused an issue with the Microsoft operating system. And we identified this very quickly and remediated the issue.
Kurtz was adamant that nothing nefarious was at play. While the issue has been dealt with and businesses are starting to come back online, it'll be hours, if not days, before everything and everyone is back on track. I do not envy him in this moment, because telling me that it was just a software update bug, but an entire airline is not able to fly because of that, right? And this is the tech CEOs and their universe and ours is just so different, right? There's the idea of they call it downstream impacts. I'm like, that is the only impact that matters. Can I use your product and still live my life? If the answer is no, your product's not good enough right now. So I don't envy him, but it does also point out that we are absolutely not prepared for the zombie apocalypse.
No, well, we're certainly not prepared for that. But we're also just so reliant on these things, right? And so something goes wrong, apparently with a software update. I mean, we'll see if that actually is the case or not.
Oh, I like that skepticism there. Thank you.
Well,
yes.
I'm generally skeptical of tech explanations of things. But it is just like, it's like pulling the pin out of everything. Everything just collapses because somebody screwed up a software update. We have, people at the Hill struggling to get back from the Republican National Convention because their flights are grounded. I have friends, talking about how they were messed up in various ways. I don't typically use Microsoft. Maybe I can't say that on air. Maybe I'll get punished for something. But it is just this example of how much hinges upon all of these programs.
Well, and I know our friend Robbie would not agree with this as the answer. So I appreciate
Government
that.
regulation, Nayyera,
well,
that's the solution.
I'm just going to say that the idea that Microsoft went through an entire lawsuit for the fact that it needed to break up different parts because it was monopolizing access to the internet and information. And this is why you don't want one thing running everything. It's why we don't want government running everything also, to be fair. But in the public space, who's responsible for making sure Microsoft isn't running everything? Right.
Well, and those arguments about the public space, I think, they increasingly intersect with debates about tech all the time. It's like the Twitter now X argument, right? Which is that the public square? Do people have a right to be on there? Or is it a private company and the proprietors of that private company can decide who gets to say what and where the lines are drawn? So the sort of fusion of the issues around big tech and the issues around the public space, I do think are really interesting.
And it's going to be increasingly more evident in our day-to-day, right? Like we talk about social media influence on the development of young people. And it's not about, let me be very clear, it's not about the content, but about, do you have choices? And we keep thinking we're making choices, but algorithms, the impact and the dopamine push, these are not active choices we're making anymore. I mean, Delta, and even various government agencies, they sign up, they get a package, and it's like, oh, look how easy Microsoft made everything for us. Right. Look how easy Google made everything for us. So I think part of it is tech has made something so much easier, but we don't know all of the stuff underlying it. And so when something goes, oops, we're sitting here like, what just happened to what happened to my life?
Sure, and so many different places reliant on the same company and the same product. I mean, I think that really is where the difficulty hinges, because everything about the digital world is so vast. There's this attempt to have common cords or common threads that tie it together, and suddenly those cords get knotted in some way and you're in a world of pain, and it has a real effect on people's day-to-day lives.
I will say though, Europe having done the common cord, the C thing, I'm over replacing my phone charger every upgrade. I am for literally the common cord that we're talking about for chargers, but Europe has handled the tech piece of this very differently in terms of their giving consumer choices and forcing that. That's something companies tell us about the cookies that we're accepting, our personal privacy and our information and what we're giving up, the idea of informed consent. Like we have opted for ease with technology, and where in healthcare we've demanded more informed consent, we haven't, as a community in the United States, demanded the same of tech in a way the Europeans have. I think that's a lot of where this is going to go. But in the meantime, what's the backup plan?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do when the internet disappears?
Right. And I think one of the interesting things will be whether Congress presses CrowdStrike in particular on this outage, whether they have to come to Capitol Hill and try to explain themselves, or whether this will just be like, oh, well, these things happen, we'll on to the next thing.
Well, I will just throw in this as a little aside that Congress would need to itself understand how a lot of this technology works. I still have seared into my brain that the members of the Senate questioning Facebook CEO and talking about Twitter because they literally could not understand the difference between the two.
Sure.
And so that idea of having members of Congress who actually represent us and our values and even our current technology and our experiences with them would be helpful in this conversation, Niall.
Certainly would. On that point, we'll leave it there for the moment, and we will be back with more Rising after this.
I have been to many conventions. I have never been to a more fun convention or a convention with better vibes.
That was, of course, ousted Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson, who snagged a top spot in the final night of the Republican National Convention on Thursday. Now, Mr. Carlson has had a love-hate-love relationship with former President Trump, including a series of texts that were exposed in the case between Fox and Dominion voting systems. Tucker appears to have changed his tune again on the twice-picked presidential nominee, from saying he hates Trump in those 3-year-old texts to praising him these days. Here is more from Tucker Carlson. Let's watch.
This is a law of nature. And in that moment, Donald Trump, months before the presidential election, became the leader of this nation. And Donald Trump, whatever you say about him, and I think he's a wonderful person. I know him well. By the way, the funniest person I've ever met in my life, actually. You can't be funny without perspective or without empathy, which is true. But everything else about Trump aside, he actually cares because he's interested in the people who live here because that's his job. A father's job, his duty is to his family. An officer's duty is to his men. A president's duty is to his citizens. And he seems to be the only one who thinks that. And in his choice for vice president, J.D. Vance, he's made that really clear.
Tucker Carlson wrapped his speech to a standing ovation at the RNC, and an excitement that transitioned seamlessly on social media, with several users on X revering this 11-minute keynote address. Megyn Kelly, his former co-host at Fox, had this to say: absolutely beautiful by Tucker Carlson. He had everyone riveted, no notes, no prompter, spoke eloquently from the heart. What a moment. Others called him most inspiring, phenomenal, and applauded him for not using a teleprompter. I think that's a low bar, though, right? to be presented with an audience that is already primed to cheer everything that is said from the podium, and then to now at this point be given credit for being able to talk without a teleprompter, right? I mean, that was a litany of the anti-Biden talking points. And to be blunt, this is what Tucker was known for on his television show, right? Had a whole platform that allowed him to capture and be riveted with that audience, got fired from that platform, Fox News, and now was at the same event with the owner, with Rupert Murdoch. I mean, the Fox Trump thing. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, just to, if our audience isn't familiar with the text that we were referencing there in the introduction, so people might have forgotten the times when Tucker Carlson, well, it transpired that he was much more skeptical of Trump than he was publicly letting on. And so these were text conversations in 2021 where he said, quote, "We are very, very close to being able to ignore Trump most nights," unquote, and, quote, "I truly can't wait," end quote. And that just, I think, is indicative of how he presents a particular public persona that is obviously enormously pro-Trump, while having said completely different things in the past, suggesting a sort of a willingness, I think, to get close or be close to power and to protect his own position. I do find it odd that someone for whom these things are on the record can position themselves as a kind of figure of moral courage in some fashion.
Well, that's exactly what the vice presidential pick on the Republican side is doing, is J.D. Vance. I mean, he had an entire book in which he said that Trump was either a useful idiot or going to be Hitler. And now he gets on the stage 4 years later and talks about how Trump is the thing and he supports him. So that's kind of what the RNC stage ended up being, were these people who formerly criticized Trump now being brought out to accolades and appreciation, and they get the power and the access that comes with that in exchange for disavowing or pretending like the previous things and criticisms simply didn't exist. Is that, is Fox News going to be able to pull that same type of turnaround with Trump? Because Trump came out in favor of Tucker when he got fired. Trump felt like Fox News wasn't doing him the kind of service that he wanted. They were being too critical. Actually, it all stemmed from Fox News being the first one to call Arizona for Biden, which was based on the numbers, based on facts.
Unproven correct.
Trump, and it's proven in court now. Trump didn't like that. Is this what we're seeing at the RNC, is kind of the making up of that relationship?
Possibly. I mean, I do think the media picture in relation to conservative media and Trump is very interesting. I mean, what clearly happened, if you look back at that whole court case, was that Fox, in the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election, was very worried about losing audience share to outlets even further to the right than it is or was. So now you have Tucker Carlson having this very prime speaking slot at the Republican National Convention. Rupert Murdoch somewhat more sidelined, it would appear. He was there, but obviously Rupert wouldn't be speaking from the stage. A very interesting dynamic there, and we'll see how it plays out.
That conservative ecosystem is certainly very powerful, and it's part of what we talk about with mainstream media, right? This is linear television, cable news, the place that all the elected officials go to make their rounds, including the Republicans on Fox, the Democrats on MSNBC, and it's hard to understand where that sense of common ground will come in that unity. But clearly, the Republican National Committee they were pushing that unity message throughout, and their sense of unity was very Tucker Carlson, Viktor Orban, very much in that Christian nationalist. This is what the country should look like and should feel like, and they tried for some diversity on that stage.
On the Carlson point, not to get us off the diversity issue, but on the Carlson point, what is your read on whether he has actual political ambitions himself or not? I couldn't figure that out. Watching him, he clearly lapped up the applause. He was speaking from the stage at a political convention. There had, as you know, been at one time speculation about him as like a running mate or whatever. Yeah. Do you think he has any inclination to that, or do you think he's just happy being his media?
Oh, well, I think he was very unhappy having lost his massive media platform and being able to just have this audience that is feeding you energy and you're that call and response thing. It's something that I think Biden's struggling with too, and this is probably the only time I will compare the two of them, because as individuals and policies are very different. But that idea of once you're in that position where you get people to listen to you and you feed off their energy, Trump, Biden, Tucker, they come alive
for sure
in front of an audience in a way they just don't on a teleprompter or something else, and that type of feedback, and I think it's very hard for them to let it go. So if that were offered to him as politics, I think he'd take it. But I certainly don't think he's any of these the guys are doing this for a true act of public service, and they have a part of the system that they really want to fix. That's not what politics is to them.
No, certainly not. And I think politics is increasingly resembling a sort of form of celebrity, quite honestly, and that's a big part of the deal. Anyhow, we shall see you for more Rising after this. The pressure is intensifying on President Biden. Democratic leaders, including former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, have all reportedly expressed concern to Biden over his chances at winning in November, and they're also apparently concerned that he could drag Democrats down with him. Now, some observers have suggested that Biden could drop out as the Democratic nominee as early as this weekend, but his campaign has insisted he's staying in the race. A Biden campaign email sent just this morning said, quote, Joe Biden has made it more than clear he's in this race and he's in it to win it. Moreover, he's the presumptive nominee. There is no plan for an alternative nominee. In a few short weeks, Joe Biden will be the official nominee. Not sure how many times you can get the words nominee into a brief sentence. Anyway, joining us now to discuss what she is hearing about Biden is Democratic strategist Nomiki Konst. So, Nomiki, what do you make of it all? Is he going to ultimately be the nominee or not?
And the signs are not looking great right now. Granted, there have been a lot of behind-the-scenes chatter. There have been unnamed sources that have heard conversations between Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and now former President Obama. But right now, obviously there are a lot of folks who have their agendas. They want to have Kamala Harris as the nominee. They want an open convention. They want a drag-out fight. They want to push Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro. People have their agendas. And oftentimes, not always, oftentimes those agendas are attached to jobs and contracts and money because presidential politics is a big game. But we don't have time. Right after the convention, within 90 days, we go into early voting. So I think ultimately the decision that has to be made, and this is really probably why it's taking 2 weeks, is whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris can put together a campaign, which is probably the easiest campaign to put together since she's on the same ticket as President Biden, in fast enough time and get those polls up. What is that campaign going to look like? How are they going to play that out at the convention without making people feel like it was undemocratic? These are probably the internal questions that are happening, but in conversations that I'm having with folks are frustrated that the Biden administration campaign are taking so long to decide. But I personally think that's because they need to keep their eye on those polls and see if it is truly a better bet to pass the baton on to Vice President Harris,
and
which is probably most likely. Just
briefly, Nomiki, because I know Nayyera wants to get in here, but do you think they would be better changing nominee?
I think it would be nice to have a convention with many choices. We're battling time, but Dr. Jim Zogby, who served with me on the Unity Reform Commission, laid out a plan where you have these candidates run around the country for a series of a few weeks. They give rallies and speeches talking about the Democratic platform, fresh blood, fresh ideas, and then you have the convention. But we don't have that time now. We have a couple of weeks. That would have been the greatest plan. So now we have a situation in which President Biden's polls just keep sinking. The morale is very low. And I think it's time for him to step aside so we can move on to another candidate. I don't know if that next candidate is the right candidate, though. So this is a really difficult situation. We blame the DNC. I have to be very clear here. The DNC has rules in place. They had reforms that they were supposed to institute after 2016 that they did not, and it would have prevented a situation like this. The reason why they didn't institute them is because they really did want to have Vice President Biden become the presidential nominee in 2020. And maybe it is true that he was the only person that could have beaten Trump, but it doesn't mean that you suspend democracy, democratic systems in your own party to do so. And that's how we got to this point where everybody knew President Biden was 81 years old, had gaffes. It's a very grueling schedule. But if they weren't suspending any sort of debate and collaboration and real primary structure, then we wouldn't be in this situation, I truly believe, and we would have the strongest candidate to run against former President Trump.
Nomiki, you have expressed a lot of the frustration I felt too, which is that there are processes in place to have these kinds of conversations, and it's not a matter of, a couple of days before the convention, let's suddenly shake everything up because some billionaire donors realized what party activists and folks like yourself had known for quite some time. So bringing it back to your point, this is a DNC problem. Is part of their issue that they just are terrified of a convention that isn't as easy to predict and plot out every second, that is no longer about the show on stage and how it looks at TV, but is an actual discussion and family conversation?
Absolutely. In 2016, I personally was on the receiving end of this when I was with Bernie 2016 as a surrogate on the convention floor, on his platform and eventually his Unity Reform Commission committee. They wanted to shut down any sort of debate. They didn't want any sort of pushback on the platform. They had their delegates going in on the other side and said, on the platform committee, you vote for these things and you just vote for them. And they had their whips telling them to vote for them. But on our side, we actually deliberated and we had conversations. And we wanted to do that with the other side, the old guard of the Democratic Party. The problem is now, I truly believe the majority of the members, the elected members of the DNC, I truly believe that they do want these reforms. They do want change. They voted for them in 2018. The problem is they have this appointed committee at the top, not to get too wonky here, called the Rules Committee and the Executive Committee. They're appointed. They're not voted in, and they have more authority over the voting members of the DNC. And those members oftentimes are lobbyists and consultants and very big donors. So ultimately, what you just said was so correct. Is this about a bunch of billionaires in Los Angeles now frustrated that they're not going to give money to the Biden-Harris ticket and they're not going to give money to congressional candidates and Senate candidates? Yeah, that's what's making them freak out. But they should have been freaking out, 8 years ago when we had this problem in 2016 and in 2008 when we had an earlier version between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It's an institution, and the folks running the show that are not elected, the staff, they're institutionalists, and they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to see change. They don't want to see reforms. And they've been giving the excuses that, well, we don't want to lose the money because we have to compete against Republicans. There's plenty of good money around there. This is basic good governance. We have gotten to a crisis, and it's a question of hubris at this point.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has, I think, surprised a lot of people on the outside of the DNC process by saying that folks aren't ready for what would really happen if you take that lid off the pot of Biden leaving and what that means for the party. And she's still saying that Biden should stay. Many of the other elected, the squad, the progressive members of Congress are thinking he should stay. And there seems like a really big disconnect between how folks on the outside identify as what progressive should be and then the folks who are inside the party structure are advocating right now. Help us understand what is going on with progressives right now.
Well, I think, on domestic issues, and not all issues, President Biden has come across more progressive than we would have expected. Not everything, not ideal. I'm fully aware of that. But if you're a member of Congress and you're a progressive member of Congress, and you've built that relationship with the Biden administration, you want to stick with what you know. And I completely understand that from the perspective of wanting to get legislation passed, wanting to stay on your committees, wanting to have an open line with the White House. The alternative, you may not have that. So I see it from a congressional member's perspective, but that is not a campaign perspective. We're talking about beating this machine, this well-oiled Republican National Committee that's unified. You have folks that don't agree with Donald Trump now campaigning for Donald Trump, never Trumpers campaigning for Donald Trump because he's a Republican. You have a doubling down of the Project 2025 platform. You have J.D. Vance, who's being propped up and has been propped up by Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk, who's controlling a lot of this debate online, who's putting $25 million a month into the Republicans. So we can't take these chances right now. I really just think it's a reset at this point. I mean, do I think it would have been better if yes, like we had made this decision earlier? Absolutely. But now we're in a situation where it's on a downward decline, a rapidly downward decline in terms of morale, in terms of polling. And it would just give the Democrats a little bit of a boost to have another option, and hopefully a good option. Most likely going to be Vice President Harris, I don't think she would be my option, but I think that's the real likelihood, mainly just because of structural stuff. You have a campaign committee that she has to take over. You have to raise money. You have to do mailers, to do flyers. It has to make sense. If there was suddenly going to be 5 or 6 candidates at that convention, it would create a lot of chaos, and it would create a lot of backroom deals as well. That's just the history of the DNC.
Nomiki, just to drill back down onto the progressive side of this, because I do think it's legitimately very interesting. I mean, I understand the practical concerns about what happens if you replace Biden. There's kind of chaos. There's a very short period before the convention and all of that. But when one hears like AOC or Congresswoman Omar or others making the argument that is de facto support of Biden, it sometimes seems to me that they're sort of arguing, well, in the circumstances, he's the best that we can do. And that is tonally a very different argument than we're accustomed to hearing from progressives, which is typically, don't set the horizons too low, don't suggest that politics can only change sort of between A and B rather than A and Z. Does that not strike you as discordant that they're basically making that argument?
I think there's a reality in that we don't really have any cards right now at the table. They're making a decision based on their own needs and to be the best progressive Congress members for their districts and for the country. And if that means having an open line to President Biden, if that's the case, then so be it. That'll keep them in stronger positions. I'm arguing from a perspective of the Democratic Party is really about to screw up and not have an option, and the energy and the unity and frankly the money. I hate to say that these billionaires are holding us hostage, but they are. They're holding us hostage. They're pulling out their money for a nationwide campaign. Now, I can understand why AOC and Representative Ilhan Omar made this decision weeks ago. But now it's so clear that morale is so low and that the Biden campaign is being pushed up against the wall and the walls are closing in that I don't know how you can honestly stay with Biden at this point, other than the fact that you just want to keep the administration on course with what it's been campaigning on and keep working with them. But just say that. That's all. Just say that. Say why you're supporting them, because that's also a good argument. But the rest of the country that's on the Democratic side is afraid of what's going to happen, especially after Donald Trump's speech last night, that 90-minute long, love letter to Viktor Orban and Kim Jong-un and, the wildest members across the world. This is what I think so many Democrats are afraid of, and that's why morale is falling. So it's really about how do you boost the morale, and it might just be swapping out a candidate.
Well, to that point, though, I mean, what is the hope in terms of if President Biden remains determined to stay, and obviously, we all know the delegates and the primaries, blah, blah, blah. If he remains determined to stay, from your conversations, is the hope simply that by more Democrats coming forward publicly and saying they do want him to step aside, that the pressure will ultimately be irresistible and that his position will be basically untenable?
I think that's what's happening right now. I mean, 5 days ago, after Donald Trump was shot, I think folks thought maybe President Biden was the best option, that, okay, it's calmed down a little bit. He rode the storm out, which is what he usually does, and which is what a lot of Democrats are now doing, is they're riding out the controversy storms, the cancellation storms. They just ride it out and they end up on the other side. But that's not the case in this situation. Senator Schumer, I think when President Biden got COVID and he said that, hours before only a health situation would cause him to reassess, and then Senator Schumer called for him to step down, and then you're hearing rumblings of President Obama. I don't see a pathway out for him at this point. And that's why I believe, the New York Times and other publications have said he's probably going to make a decision, an open decision in the next couple of days. I just don't see it playing out well. It's just going to keep growing, and there's going to be more vocal, and you're going to be at the convention, and it's going to end up, I think they're going to push him at the convention to release his delegates to potentially another candidate. And then that's where it really gets messy, because you could have had a 2-week or 3-week conversation about who that next candidate was, whether it was going to be several candidates or whether it was going to be Kamala Harris. But at least there was preparation. If he waits all the way to the convention, it's going to be toxic. You're going to see the worst of the worst come out. They're going to be airing dirty laundry on television, which, of course, the Democrats never want to see or do. And it's only going to weaken us in terms of defeating the RNC right now and Trump.
Well, that is certainly what they should be looking to avoid, but we are quickly creeping our way to exactly that disaster, but possibly wildly entertaining convention that you're talking about, Nomiki. Thank you so much for joining us.
I've been on the other side of it. It's entertaining for you guys, but when you're in it and you're saying, okay, what cards do I have on the table? We as progressives right now don't have a lot. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we don't have a progressive candidate. Kamala Harris is not our progressive hero. Joe Biden is as progressive as probably going to get at this point. We really have to be thinking about the next 4 years, the next 8 years. And so I'll leave you guys with that. Start planning now, start organizing now, start thinking of new platform ideas. We have some leverage here for the future.
Nomiki Konst, progressive strategist. Been a great conversation. Thanks for joining us. And we'll be back with more Rising after this. The hosts of MSNBC's Morning Joe are warning those Democrats who are trying to push President Biden out that they don't know what they have till it's gone. Let's watch.
What people close to Joe Biden have said all along is he's a man of great pride. He can be stubborn and tough. Don't back him into the corner. If he's going to do this, let him do it his way on his time frame. And when all of these reports started coming out, that's when the campaign started pushing back. And I think part of that is giving him the space to make this decision, to finish making this decision with his family this weekend.
He's also a man of faith and a man of tremendous historic accomplishment. And look, it's impossible to ignore where this is going and exactly what started it. I'm not unaware of that. At the same time, I still believe that you don't know what you have until it's gone, and that there will be that feeling at some point.
You think there'll be if he leaves the race, you think Democrats will regret it?
I do.
Yeah,
I do, because among many reasons, which I've already stated and I won't state again. Don't worry, but none of these notions are backed by a strong alternative, an alternative that has beat Trump before, an alternative that is vetted, an alternative that is tested. And so that's a lot to throw away.
The hosts were then joined by Biden campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dhillon, who insisted Biden was staying in the race. Watch.
Is Joe Biden still in the race? Does he plan to stay in the race? And if so, what's the plan?
Thanks so much for having me, Mika. And look, absolutely the president's in this race. You've heard him say that time and time again. And I think we saw on display last night exactly why, because Donald Trump is not going to offer anything new to the American people. He's the same person he was in 2020. He's the same person he was at the debate stage. He's the same person he is that is about himself and not about the American people. And Joe Biden is more committed than ever to beat Donald Trump. And we believe on this campaign, we are built for the close election that we are in, and we see the path forward. The president is the leader of our campaign and of the country, and he is clearly, in our impression and what we've built and in our engagement with voters, he's the best person to take on Donald Trump and prosecute that case and present his vision versus what we saw last night.
So, Nayyera, the fact that this has all been played out on a cable news show in and of itself, Morning Joe in particular, seems to have become this really pivotal show as this Biden crisis plays out. The hosts seem to have, I don't know, certainly their tone has changed from time to time as to whether they seem to be favouring the president staying as the nominee or making way for someone else. Is it significant in and of itself that this cable news show has become such a pivotal player here?
Oh, well, let's be clear, though, right, that this cable news show, Morning Joe, has an outsized presence in D.C. politicians' minds in a way that just simply doesn't translate to the rest of us or anybody even who actually lives in the internet where so much more conversation and interesting thought is happening. Part of why we're watching what Joe and Mika are doing is because it is known that they have a strong relationship, personal relationship with Biden. So many other elected officials are watching to see what former Congressman Joe Scarborough has to say. So it's like you're watching the pawns and the bishops as everyone's figuring out how do you get to checkmate. That's the piece that Morning Joe plays in all of this. And yes, the campaign chairwoman, of course she's going to come out and say the guy's in the race. Because guess what? He's in the race until he says he's not. Like we're operating in this in between that we want to happen, that the Biden campaign is not going to acknowledge is even happening until it's signed, sealed, delivered, done.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that when people raise this issue of, well, the Biden campaign says he's in and committed, I find that such a bizarre argument that actually signifies anything at all. What's he going to say? He's not going to say I'm half in or I'm thinking about getting out, but I might stay in. The nature of politics is you're in until you're out, right? And that's just as simple as that. Taking aside from the actual sort of media component of this argument that either it would be too problematic, logistically for Biden to step aside, or that, there are questions about who would replace him, primarily whether Vice President Harris would be a better candidate against Trump or not. What do you think of that argument?
What has driven so much of this conversation about Biden leaving is the now open awareness that Biden is aging, and that aging is leading to a decline. That is known and has been known for quite some time. I mean, Trump and Biden, they're old, right? And they're by definition well past qualifying for Social Security and Medicare, right? That they are senior citizens, but the vigor does not look the same at all. And Biden had come in saying he was going to be that transitional president, with Kamala Harris being part of that ticket as a representation of this is what the Democratic Party is, right? It can bring all of these people into its tent. The fact that it is not obvious and the next sentence out of people's mouths who are billionaire donors, who are, former Obama colleagues of mine saying Biden should step aside, it should be Kamala, is very telling, right? Because she's the vice president. She has gone through an election cycle already, right? Like she is a known quantity. All of the logistics line up, but we all know it's out there, this thing that once you take Biden away, what is that opportunity for everybody else? And that everybody else piece is very, very messy in the Democratic Party right now. So I think it's very telling that it's still just focused on Biden leaving and not what it means for Kamala to step up.
But the two things are related though, right? Because one of the issues is the fear that Kamala Harris is not, in fact, a very strong candidate. And you said she's a known quantity, which is true to a degree. But her 2020 primary campaign obviously was pretty underwhelming by every reasonable measure. So you have in her a candidate who I think many Democrats have real worries about, at the same time as they understand it's difficult, should Biden step aside, to jump past Kamala Harris, partly, frankly, because she's the first female vice president, first black vice president, first woman of South Asian heritage as vice president. So it is a bit of a bind for Democrats here. I don't think we should understate that.
No, and that's what is not being openly discussed, right? What does this do to the Democratic Party to have not had this discussion as part of an actual open primary, which you usually don't primary your own incumbent. Right. You don't. That's just not how things are done. And that's where the whole country is at, watching what the Democratic Party is going to do, what the DNC is going to do. Technically, she has the delegates as well. It's a Biden-Harris delegate. So him releasing the delegates, there is, I think, some maneuver where they could be hers, right? It's so the technical argument that she is actually the only one who could step in, because if it's not her, nobody else was on that primary ballot to then have had enough votes. So all of that being this technicality of a bureaucracy that is now the Democratic Party, and at the heart of it, at the core of it is, if this is only about Biden being in cognitive decline, can anyone, whether it's Kamala or Gretchen or Gavin, step in who is just simply has more energy and be more effective? If they can answer, if the Democratic Party can answer that and be okay with anyone else, then I think there's a path forward. I actually wonder, though, if some of those other people you mentioned have an inclination to get involved or would rather sit it out for another 4 years. Exactly. Why come into this mess right now when you'd have to run against Trump which is not fun. You would be inheriting a total disaster of fundraising and party politics. When these folks are in it for their political ambition and their own longevity, they have time. And that's the thing, Biden doesn't.
Right. And I mean, I think the danger, if you're a Gavin Newsom or a Gretchen Whitmer, is that you get into this, whether as potentially a running mate to Kamala Harris or an opponent of Kamala Harris to get the nomination. And either way you lose. And in some of those permutations, you've divided the party or are blamed for dividing the party, whereas you can just keep your powder dry and hope that in 2028, or either Whitmer or Newsom would be young enough to go again in 2032, even if there were a Harris presidency that lasted a significant period of
This
time.
is all assuming, right, that these people are making the calculus that the rules of the system will still exist in the same way. I mean, this is where a lot of the folks on the Democratic side of the aisle are talking about the actual rules and system, and democracy is under threat. So you want to make your own political power calculation for 4 years down the road. Some people are actually worried about what's going to happen in that next 4 years, that is the focus of this next election. And Democrats haven't honed in on what's actually the focus of the next election.
So many different permutations playing out. We'll be back with more Rising after this. The Republican National Convention came to an end in Milwaukee last night with a 90-minute-plus speech from former President Trump. He kicked off that speech talking about the recent attempt on his life before segueing into the more standard Trumpian rhetoric that we've all come to expect. So, has the convention been a success? Where has it left the former president? And what happens next? To discuss all this, we're joined by Republican strategist Whitley Yates. Whitley, welcome.
It's good to be here.
You were in Milwaukee, were you not?
I was in Milwaukee.
How was the atmosphere on the floor during that speech?
I mean, it was tantalizing. People were excited, they were invigorated, they were chanting, and it really just felt like a time where Republicans were coming together. And I think that overall, the entire convention was a huge success.
And in terms of this purported new tone by former President Trump, did you think he struck a new tone, or did you think it was kind of standard Trump stuff?
I would say there were resonances of a softer tone in his speech, but there were also the resemblance of the Trump that we all know. And I think that if he were to come out and be completely different, it would be disingenuous to who he was and people wouldn't believe it. It would feel unauthentic. And so I do believe that there was a softer tone that you could tell, but he is Trump and he's going to be exactly who he is. And I think that that is honestly the best way for him to convey his message.
I actually agree with you for what it's worth. Sorry, Nayyera, you were trying to get in there. But I mean, I actually don't love this media tendency to constantly find a new Trump or suggest Trump's about to pivot. Trump is Trump and he's always going to be Trump, and roughly half the country hates it and roughly half the country loves it, and that's kind of where it is.
And that's the appeal, like you said, the authenticity, that idea that, yeah, with Trump, you always know what you get. Why then this effort at a softer tone? Because we've heard it talked about, and the RNC also mentioned, you get excerpts of remarks earlier, and that first section of the speech did some of that, and then Trump was himself. So why bother to be anything different right now?
I'm going to be honest. I think with the polarization leading to assassination attempts, it is incumbent upon both leaders in both parties and everyone downstream to have a softer tone, to not demonize each other and to not push fear-mongering so we don't have situations like we've had. And we don't necessarily know the reasoning, but clearly if you are drawn to pull a weapon on a political personality or someone running for office, then you have some pretty strong hate in your heart. And so I think the softer tone is just basically from what has happened in Pennsylvania and wanting to make sure that we're not inciting people to violence against political.
If he can't keep that softer tone, is that going to then be a problem for this polarized moment and this idea that violence is easily incited right now?
I think that having a core message of unity is what is necessary, and that is what he's doing. Even though he is still going to be Trump, he can push unity without uniformity and making it seem like he's not being genuine or unauthentic. And the truth is that you should be able to hold elected officials accountable and it not feel like a blood sport.
But I mean, whenever he talks about crazy Nancy Pelosi, for example, I mean, you would accept that that's not particularly unifying, I'm assuming.
I wouldn't say that that is particularly unifying, but calling her a threat to democracy is different. Utilizing terms like putting her in a bullseye that's the type of rhetoric that we're trying to eradicate.
But I mean, I don't see what the distinction is that you're making.
You don't think that there's a distinction between placing someone in the bullseye or that they are a threat to democracy is different from calling them crazy?
No, I don't, actually.
Okay, well.
So then, jumping in between the two of you then, the idea of demonizing people, and that's, all right, so crazy maybe is a shade before you get to that next step of what to do about the crazy, right? But it starts with give them a label and then you hint at actions. What about then the rhetoric about immigration? One of his favorite talking points is about talking about how immigrants are a disease. He's used language like vermin. He's used language about what it does to the blood of our country. Now, granted, that's not what he said at the debate, but it was what he said immediately at the rally after. And that Trump is great at playing to the crowd, and the crowd was responding to that. So if you are an immigrant or a migrant watching that, how do you not think that you're a target of this unity?
I mean, I think that you should think that you're a target if you came into this country illegally. That is a criminal act. And so there should be no cover of communication for criminals. If you came into this country illegally and you didn't go through the proper means, you should not be here. And I don't understand why we would need to cover or why we would need to placate to people who are breaking the law to enter this country. I'm confused at why we would need to have softer rhetoric.
It's a misdemeanor offense to cross the border illegally. It's not a felony, and in this country generally we do have that idea of a trial or some sort of justice process before we very rarely condemn people to death. And so the question is the rhetoric about immigrants and saying that they're poisoning the blood of the country, right? Is there a difference between that and then what incites violence against people who just happen to be brown?
I haven't heard any condemning them to death. He's condemning them to deportation back to where they came from, which is what should have happened already. And so I don't think that it's about having victimized speech towards people who've come into this country illegally when they are victimizing citizens here. They're attempting to protect us. And I think it's important that we're using accurate language to depict not only what they're doing. A misdemeanor is a misdemeanor. You break into my car, that may be a misdemeanor if you don't take anything. But why are we attempting to placate to criminals? I'm not understanding why we are having this soft heart. The truth is that if you want to come into America, there is a process. And by jumping over steps of the process, it's not right. And a president saying that he's going to protect our nation by making sure that that process is upheld should not be considered demonized language.
Okay, so just to confirm then, the calling immigrants as poisoning the blood of the country is not a problem.
I didn't say that calling immigrants or saying poisoning the blood of the country isn't right. What I'm saying is I do not have sympathy for people that come into this country and that purport crimes upon our citizens who did not utilize the process necessary through immigration to come here accurately. And anyone saying that they want to deport them or to remove them from this country is doing us a service as Americans.
Obviously, shifting gears a bit, Whitley, there's obviously the issue of President Biden and whether he's going to survive as the Democratic nominee. How much of a conversation topic was that at the convention, like aside from whatever was said from the podium?
I'm going to be honest, the conversations around Biden were not about whether or not he was going to sustain in his campaign. It was really centered around who's been running this country, because it's kind of clear that his cognition didn't just decline, that it's been on the decline. And so the question that on everyone's mind is who's been making the decisions, who has been the person that has been kind of guiding this entire administration, because we know it's not been him. And it doesn't necessarily matter, and this is what I heard from a lot of sources and a lot of delegates, it doesn't matter who's at the top of the ticket on the left, because the policies are going to be the same and the administration is going to run the same. So it doesn't matter who they switch out. It doesn't matter who AI fakes or Kamala Harris or anybody else, because they believe President Trump is going to win no matter what.
And is the not switching out, did you hear people in terms of talking about Biden leaving, that Kamala? Like, is Kamala for the GOP a more desirable opponent because she'd be easier to beat in some way? Is that the thinking?
Absolutely not. I think she's less desirable because when looking at the results of how she was VP and how the border crisis, which she was tasked to handle, has been mishandled, absolutely not. They see her as someone who is going to continue to purport the exact same issues that have led us here with the migrant and illegal immigrant crisis.
Do you think anyone at the convention was a surprise, either for good or for bad? Like, was there anyone who either outperformed or underperformed expectations?
I would say that the vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, was phenomenal. I think he used storytelling very well. And I think that there were just moments where Americans could come behind and find semblance or some type of common ground in his story. People from all walks of life, whether that be those who have people dealing with addiction in their family, those who've grown up in poor socioeconomic status. I mean, I just felt like he really spoke to the fabric of this country. And I think that he exceeded very well. I mean, obviously, Baby Dog was talked about heavily. And then you also have Trump's beautiful granddaughter, Kai, who I think just kind of humanized him for just one moment, but also let us know that like he's still a Trump and he tries to get in my head and make me lose when we play golf together, because you could just kind of visualize Trump doing that and not wanting to lose, even if it's to his granddaughter. But I think overall, the speakers were very interesting, very unique, very diverse, I would say. And it wasn't necessarily the speakers that we expected that created the greatest resonance and had the best impact. It was the unexpected speakers that I believe created that level of impact.
Did anyone fall flat or no?
Did anyone fall flat? Not that I saw. I think everyone went up there. They had their own specific mission of what they wanted to say and what they wanted to do and what they wanted to incite and make people feel. And I think everyone was pretty spot on. I don't think anyone flatlined. I actually believe when Trump said it in his speech that everyone did well, that he was being quite honest.
The humanizing of Trump. Traditionally, the first lady or the first lady nominee is the person who most humanizes the man at the top of the ticket. Melania spoke at the first convention that Trump won that one. She didn't speak at this one. What's up with that?
She released a statement, and I think we have to consider this from a different perspective. She's a former first lady who just watched her husband be shot at. He could have lost his life. And to be back out 7 days later in front of large crowds, I don't think we should expect her to be standing on that stage and next to him, especially considering where she grew up and the war-torn nature of those environments. And so I think her releasing her message, and I think her being there is important, but saying that, well, you need to humanize him and you need to get up there and you need to do all of these things, I think that we are placing what we want to see on her and not what she's comfortable with.
So just as a point of clarity, she is by origin Eastern European. Her country has not been war-torn for generations, but she was on the campaign trail the first time around, and she has not. It's not that she was deciding because of this assassination attempt not to participate. She hasn't been on the campaign trail at all. She just hasn't been a vocal female partner presence for the president. And is that going to be a challenge in the coming months when the female vote is going, the idea of women's rights are on the ballot for people across the political spectrum? Is her absence going to be a challenge for the Trump campaign?
I don't think so, because I think that plays into identity politics to say, well, you need a woman standing beside you so that women can see a woman and feel like it's okay to vote for you. He's doing well in the polls. He's doing well when he is, getting donors. As he said, they've raised even money for the victims from PA. So if the donors are happy and the polls show that he is ahead in the polls, ahead in most states, and is on a path of victory, I don't understand why having a symbol of this femininity next to him is necessary for him to win when he's doing well without it. We know that she supports her husband. We read it in her statement. And so that should be good enough.
That is a certainly different type of first lady. And I personally welcome her carving her own path forward in this.
Whitley Yates, thanks for joining us. Thanks for that recap on the Republican National Convention. And we'll be back with more Rising after this.
You can try, but you'll never really be one of us. That's the message given by MAGA acolytes to California lawyer, Republican National Committee woman, Trump defender, and conservative media star Harmeet Dhillon. She was invited to give an opening prayer at the Republican convention, and she did in her faith as a Sikh woman. Her mostly English language prayer for Trump was met with this type of response. Day one of the RNC was complete with satanic chants and multiple prayers to false gods. She was accused of witchcraft as part of this. There is no South Asian woman who has done more directly for Trump than Harmeet Dhillon. Right, that's just a matter. That she has risen as a star in the Republican Party, and the people who ultimately make up the Trump base completely rejected her, even though she was invited on that stage by party leaders. There is still this big disconnect in this unity message of what it means to be uniform. Rather, actually, that's what it is. It's not about unity. There's still this push to be uniform.
Well, I had honestly missed this controversy until you brought it to my attention, so credit to you for doing that. I mean,
I tend to watch a little bit about what happens with South Asian women in the public space.
That's understandable for sure. I do think, some of those comments seem pretty noxious that were directed at her, and the perception that anything that isn't Christian or Judeo-Christian is somehow subversive in some way. That seems to be quite a strong strand in certainly the Trump era Republican Party. It's sad. I mean, I think that obviously people should have the freedom for any or no religious belief at all. And this was a convention that seemed largely to sort of foreground Christianity. Trump himself paying tribute to God or thanking God for his survival of that assassination attempt on Saturday. I mean, obviously Christian conservatives have been a big part of the Republican base for a long time, but pretty distasteful stuff directed there.
Well, and the embrace, and this has been a challenge in Christian communities, the embrace by white evangelicals rather, as Black evangelicals are different in this, white evangelicals' embrace of Trump when they see such a disconnect of the values, but they get the policies that they have been espousing, particularly on choice. And now where does that go next? That's been part of the conversation. Such a debate about how abortion would be discussed as part of the Republican Party platform. But what you saw in that moment, right, was this, first of all, misunderstanding of what monotheism is. Sikhism is the youngest religion in the world and actually is an extension and combination of many things from monotheistic traditions. So they believe in one God. You also have at the same time the Republican Party and Trump really having engaged Indian American migrants and immigrants, folks who have a sense of nationalism, the Hindutva party, so the connection between Modi and India, that national religious populism and Trump, like very much a similar dynamic and a lot of financial support. So by that I mean the folks like Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley. There is definitely a concerted effort by the Republican Party to appeal to South Asians, but a particular set of South Asians too. What I got from that though was that it doesn't matter how much money you have or how much status or how much you've done for MAGA. At the end of the day, if you are showing up and you say something in a different language, or you have a scarf on your head that doesn't look like the Catholic scarf that Melania wore in front of the Pope, you can still be derided and rejected by a big part of the MAGA base because you don't look or talk like a white Christian nationalist.
And that obviously was very powerful. Now, who invited, I mean, it was obviously the Republican Party who invited her to speak in the first place,
She's a rising star. She's on the Republican National Committee. Like, she helps run the Republican Party right now.
So do you think there's any, contrast is the wrong word, but I mean, clearly there are some within the Republican Party who do see a desire or an aspiration towards diversity, otherwise she wouldn't have been speaking in the first place. Do you think those people are disconnected from the Republican Party base then?
think it gets to that idea of when people like to say, oh, we don't do identity politics, which is, the modern version of I don't see color. And the reality is that people are different. Everyone is different. And so once you start to welcome in and say you want different, you don't get uniformity. It's really that simple, right? Like it is, you either have genuinely inclusive events and make sure that then the people who are just being jerks are not welcome or told that, or you tell people that your difference cannot be celebrated. That cannot be part of the conversation. Splitting it in the middle, this is what you end up getting, is what the RNC. So I think it was meant with good intentions to not only expand, but also they frankly had to give her some credit for all the work she's done for them. But that's not where many people in the Trump base are at. They're not ready for that.
I wanted to circle back, though, to a point that you raised a couple of minutes ago. I have no idea, but the answer to this, is the Indian American community writ large Democrat or Republican inclined, or is it just like too amorphous?
The Indian American one, over the first generation, were very heavily Democratic, and they were recognized that a lot of the immigrant experience that was beneficial, that even allowed Indians at one point were labeled as the most undesirable minority of immigrants, the most undesirable by an act of Congress. That changed as part of the civil rights movement, right? So you have a generation of Indian Americans who recognize that. Then there's a newer wave, and then there's also a younger generation. So that newer wave didn't have that experience. Many of the people you see, like Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, they were born here or they grew up in America, and they have seen Trump as somebody very empowering. And there has been a concerted effort. The RNC has done a much better job of reaching out to for example, the Indian Hotel Owners Association, and really building inroads there in a way the Democratic Party has not. Why this all matters? There's obviously the money and the donations, but there's very particular states where if you take Indian Americans and you take the broader East Asian migrant population, you're talking 2, 3, 4% of the vote. In an election that may be decided by 15,000, 11,000 votes in a state, that is a significant population. That seat in New York that was up for grabs as a special election, Indian Americans had a significant voting share in getting the Democrat elected. So this is just, again, minorities who have power and money will be demanding some kind of inclusion for all of that. And I don't think the RNC is ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that will change, though, or do you think it's going in a more, for want of a better term, nativist direction, or do you think there is any
what are your thoughts on how Trump talks about minorities these days?
Yeah, obviously the suggestion is going to deport people in massive numbers, and all of that is, I would have thought, off-putting to a lot of minorities. On the other hand, there's not even an oddity, there's the fact that he has actually apparently increased his support among the Latino community, for example, while espousing this very rigorous rhetoric on immigration and migration. As someone who, obviously myself, is an immigrant, I sometimes think that issue can be simplified a lot, because a lot of people who did go through the legal channels here have an understandable grievance about people who didn't. So the politics of that particular issue are kind of complicated.
I think you hit it on the head. No, Niall, I don't think it's that complicated. I think it's, well, I did it this way. What's your deal? But in that moment, on that stage, that audience and the people, there were boos in that audience as she's doing a prayer, right? Like they were booing her for an English language prayer in which she threw in a couple of words from another language. Right. And she even translated those. All of it is a prayer for Trump's benefit. I'm like, that's what she was saying. And they would not have been able to tell from looking at her or even be willing to know, was she legal? They assume she's legal because she's there. No. Right? Her story, her history, her actual person, none of that mattered in that moment where it's A, it's either witchcraft, or B, the people who said, you should be deported, you should not be on that stage.
Right. And I also didn't mean or didn't intend to conflate the immigration issue with the religious issue, which is...
I think that people who are minorities and who, my parents came here legally as part of a process and waited and all of that, I think a lot of these communities do get that sense of, well, we're the good ones. We did things the right way and you're the bad ones. And I don't think that benefits those communities in the long run, but that is where That's where some of what you're seeing in the Republican Party is that, okay, well, there's some good ones here. These are the good ones. Everybody else, they're the bad ones.
Right. No, there is, if you'll allow me to put a historic book plug in, there's a book, How the Irish Became White, which is all about the movement of Irish people in the United States from a marginalised group to a group that basically clambered up the social strata by kicking people who were below them in the social strata. Not a very glorious episode or pattern for my people, but there we go.
But it is a pattern nonetheless, and something very much part of the American story.
Absolutely. Nayyera, great to see you. Thanks for joining us for this week on Rising. It was my pleasure to be with Nayyera Huq. And please be sure to like, share and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Have a good weekend there. Take care of yourself.
Take care now. Take care, folks.